Okay. So I'm going to go through what I call the imperative for native plants. Why do we need native plants? What's the importance of them? And we'll go through 4 parts in part 1 and then a part 2, which is what we can do. So number 1, wildlife and ecosystems are in danger. 2, not all plants are equal. We've got native plants, we've got non-native plants. 3, if we don't do something, we're going to lose a lot of our biodiversity. And 4, it's not too late to make a difference. And then we'll get to part 2, which is what we can do about it. All right. Give me a second here. All right, I skipped a slide, but instead of trying to go back, I'm just going to tell you about it. So when I was growing up, I grew up in Michigan, and there was a vacant lot next to my house. And that vacant lot had prickly pear cactus in it, which even as a child, I knew was kind of crazy for Michigan, because it was not a desert. And I just thought it was amazing. And then somebody bought the land and they decided to clear it, and they brought the bulldozers in. And I thought, I've got to go save that prickly pear cactus. Now, I never ended up saving it because I brought it over in a box and didn't really know what to do with it and how to plant it without getting all pricked myself from the cactus. So I didn't actually do anything with it, but I think it started me thinking, even at 8 or 9 years old, that it was a problem for things to be, for the land to be developed and areas to be destroyed like that. So I think a lot of us have had these kinds of experiences. If this were a real audience, I would ask you to raise your hands and tell me about one of those. But think back, when in your life maybe you've seen something, maybe it was a long time ago, maybe it was more recent, but you saw an area get developed. And I think when that happens, a lot of us think, well, okay, that's one lot of land, but there's so much more out there that it's okay. We always feel like there's more land somewhere, there's more nature somewhere. And what we're seeing more and more is that those areas don't exist anymore. There are very few areas that have not been touched by humans. And instead we just have, an area gets plowed down, all those animals, die or leave, and they name it Shady Acres or Peregrine Hill. All right, so now we're on this slide. This is a picture of what used to be basically a small mountaintop in the Panama Canal. And when the Panama Canal was flooded, this area, it's about 3,700 acres, was left. And biologists were able to go in and figure out what was there in terms of the number of species of plants and animals. And over time, they've watched what's happened to those plants and animals and the numbers that have survived. And since that time, since this area became an island, basically all the water around it was flooded, it was cut off from the mainland. Since that time, about 40% of the species have been lost. So when we have islands of plants and animals, we lose species. So think about a nature area near your house. Around us, I think of Green Lake State in and of itself and roads. And when that happens, there isn't enough space, there isn't enough surviving plants and animals to have enough interaction for enough species to survive in order to keep a sustainable population. And so we end up losing species. We have species that go extinct when we have these island type situations. Now, as I said, on this area, on this island, they've lost 40% of the species. But what about other areas? The research that has been done on this has shown that it's about a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning if we lose a certain amount of habitat, we will lose that amount of species. So if we lose 50% of our habitat, say in the United States, then we would expect over time to lose 50% of our species. If we lose 80% of our habitat, we would expect to lose 80% of our species. So the question is, how much of our land in the US have we lost? Some of these numbers are old, but I think they still are appropriate. They're still fitting. What have we lost? As of 1986, old data, 69 million acres in urban and suburban areas in this country. And the current rate is probably even slightly higher, but over 2 million acres is lost to development each year. We've got about 4 million miles of linear roads, 43,500 square miles of blacktop, and 62,500 square miles of lawns. This is lawn at a park. So all of that is not area where native species can really survive. So the question is, if we've lost all that to other things, what's left? How much good intact habitat do we have? The estimates are that about 3 to 5% of our land remains relatively wild. Plants and animals that used to have this entire country, this entire continent, are now reduced to less than 20th of what they originally had. And so with the loss of 95% of our land, 95 plus, that means that eventually we're probably going to lose 95% of our species. All right. So what does it matter? What does it matter if we lose our species? 3 main reasons. There are aesthetic and moral reasons. Moral reasons, it's wrong to kill others, even if they're toads or frogs. Aesthetic reasons, if you've heard about things like forest bathing, phenomenon in Japan that has been come here as well. And it's basically the idea that if you go out into a forest and spend time there, you will physically feel better. You'll emotionally feel better. We need nature because it's beautiful and it's healing to us. Nature, number 2, nature can be valuable to us. Biodiversity can be valuable to us. And I think the most clear plant in the rainforest that can cure cancer, and if we lose that plant, then we lose that cure. So valuable in that sense. And number 3, I should say 3, not a second 2, systems literally sustain us. There are animals that we get food from, like bees and fish that are actually in nature, not in a factory farm. We still get wood from nature, the very oxygen that we breathe, the carbon dioxide sequestered in trees. All those are ways that nature is there for us. Nature filters our water to make it cleaner for us. And nature and all the biodiversity therein also helps with buffering our weather systems. All right, plants are the basis of all ecosystems. If you look at any web of how animals and plants are interconnections, plants are the basis. And native plants are different than non-native plants. So what's the difference? A native plant is one that has grown and been established in an area for a very long time. Usually not given as an exact number of years, but for here in us in the Eastern United States, we can think about plants and animals from another continent or another area. These plants have co-evolved with the insects and other animals. The animal change, and then the animal change, and then the plant change. And some of those connections are so strong that there is one insect that only feeds off of one plant. And what that means is if we lose that plant, we lose that insect. So the native plants are the ones that have been here. Non-native plants are the ones that have come over from other places. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of interactions that non-native plants can have here. Many have been here for a long time and may not really cause any problems. Others are extremely invasive. So, for example, there are about 50,000 non-native plants in our country. Most of them don't cause issues, but some of them, like some of the ones that I'll talk about later, do cause very significant problems. Also want to mention here that when you have something like a lawn, that's non-native and it very much does not support insects and wildlife. All right, insects, of course, are very important. If you've seen the cover of National Geographic this month, it's all about the decline in insects. Scientists have been studying it for the last few years and have been noticing the drastic drop in the number of all kinds of insects. So we talk about pollinators a lot, and pollinators, of course, are important. But there are a lot of other species, virtually all of them, that are also, their numbers are dropping very, very quickly. Insects are important for the same reason plants are important. They are right at that bottom of that food chain, and they're what everything else eats. So in addition to, you know, being pollinators, some of them, they are also the things that are eaten by the frogs and the birds and the snakes and a lot of other critters. My personal experience with insects lately is there are certain areas I've been in where I've really noticed the difference. Last year in March, I was in New Orleans, and in the city, there were like no bugs, like anywhere. And then even when I went out in natural areas, I just looked around and there were just very few bugs, very few flying bugs around me, and not a lot of other bugs I was seeing. So where I live in central New York, when I go outside in the forest, I've got 30 acres here. I do find a lot of bugs. So it depends on your area. Some areas are better than others. All right, birds need insects to survive. As an example, the chickadee, to rear one clutch of babies, chickadee must catch 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. The data is thanks to Doug Talmy and his research. So if you think about, you know, just one family of chickadees needing caterpillars, we need a lot of insects to help support our ecosystems. All right, so let's talk about an example of a non-native plant. We'll get to the ones in New York. I'm going to start with one in the Everglades. This is a tree called, and they've taken over large parts. Thank you. Sorry, I guess I got unmuted, or I got muted somehow. So there are large areas of the Everglades that have been damaged. The grasses have been damaged by the Melaleuca trees because they grow very quickly. They're from Australia, so they're from a different ecosystem. They evolved with different constraints. And they grow so quickly that 1 square mile can be dominated, 95% dominated by Melaleuca trees in just 25 years. And of course, they're trees, they're tall. That means the grasses can't grow underneath them. So if we put a Melaleuca tree in the Everglades, you've added a species. It sounds like it's more biodiverse. But unfortunately, since it restricts or kills off so many of the other species in the area, in this case in the Everglades, it is really a substantial damage to the ecosystem. All right. Here are some of the plants that we have here. If you don't recognize this one, this is called Phragmites grass. I don't know, I mean, we've got people on here from all over New York State, and I don't know how bad it is in different areas, but around here, when you go down the highway, lots of them, it's just Phragmites grass up and down both sides. You can see it's very tall. It grows in the wetter areas next to waterways, it grows in ditches, it grows up the side into the drier areas, and nothing else grows there. It has supplanted cattails, which, you know, some people talk about them having their own issues, but it has greatly reduced our biodiversity around our waterways. All right, so some of the other ones that we have in New York, if you're not familiar with them, we have buckthorn, which is a tree, takes over and really gives a very dark shade that a lot of other things can't survive in. In this picture, we've got garlic mustard, which is nicely in bloom right now, at least in Syracuse. We've got Phragmites grass that I just mentioned. A couple others that we see around here. Swallowwort is extremely invasive, lots of seeds, very hard to get rid of. And Japanese knotweed, which can take such strong hold of the land that it's extremely, extremely difficult to remove. And all of these reduce our biodiversity and basically take over large parts of the land from the native plants. All right. I want to talk just a little bit here about monarchs, which is one very important species because it is a species that requires one kind of plant. Monarchs require milkweed. It's not the only plant that they need because they also need nectar plants, but they will only reproduce and lay their eggs on milkweed plants. So one of the things that I'll talk about in a little bit of something you can do is to help with the monarch situation. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on what that consists of. So monarchs migrate north in the spring. They lay their eggs, and then their offspring then continue flying north, lay more eggs, and that happens for 3 to 4 generations. In the end of the season, whatever generation is furthest north, instead of laying more eggs, of course, because it's getting colder, they migrate south to Mexico, and they overwinter there in a very small area. Populations have really dropped in the last few decades. This is by Monarch Watch, and I don't know how clearly you can see all the details on there, but this shows from about 94, 95 up until I think the last year is 13, 14, shows how that population has gone up and down during the winter season when the monarchs are in Mexico. And the way they sort of calculate how many monarchs are there, because they're all clustered together on trees, is they do it by measuring the number of hectares of space that they take up. And so that is what has gone from about 20 hectares back in 96, 97 to the 13, 14 year, which was less than 1 hectare. Now, there are a lot of things that affect the monarchs and their survival rates. There's a lot of talk about what we can do in this country, which is basically we need more milkweed for them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there are also concerns when they do migrate to Mexico. There are some issues there as well. For example, there have been some weather systems that moved into central Mexico when they've been there, creating hail and winds, freezing temperatures. Mortality from these events have ranged from 50% in 2010 to 80% in 2002. There's also illegal logging. There was a recent outbreak of bark beetles that erodes the integrity of the forest. And then there's loss of habitat in their summer breeding grounds up here. A lot of land that used to have milkweed was, for example, alongside farms. And if you have an area alongside of a farm that has milkweed, then those butterflies can come in, and all the way north there are farms and there are ditches next to the farms with milkweed, and there's plenty of place for them to lay their eggs. And there are also other flowers growing that allow them to feed and get their nectar. Well, so many of our chemicals on our farms these days is actually expanded to cover every square inch that it can. And so we really lost a lot of milkweed throughout the eastern United States, throughout the United States. And that's the other aspect of why we're losing a lot of the monarchs. One thing I'll mention here is that when I lived in Minnesota, there was a big push to help monarchs there. And over a period of a couple of years, we could really tell the difference in how much milkweed was planted. For example, we would go out to eat at an outdoor restaurant and there would be a few little plants, you know, they have a teeny little garden there. There would be milkweed planted there. So we really got the message out in Minnesota that everyone should be planting milkweeds. So that needs to happen everywhere, not just in one place, but all the way up those corridors where the monarchs travel. All right. So what can you do? So we've got this issue, we've got native plants, we've got invasive non-native plants, we've got the issue with the monarchs. What can we do about it? As master naturalists, so you can encourage other people to do them as well. First of all, plant natives. Find some spots around your house, whether it's taking out grass, you can take out invasive species, or you can just take out, you know, other things that are there. You know, we have so many things that are planted in so many people's yards that are not native and that are really not helping our insects and our birds. So number one is, if you don't have any native plants around your home, please start looking into that. I will go through some specifics of how to do that. Remove invasive plants. You can do that for the rest of your life and not make a whole lot of progress. So pick your projects carefully. Think about, you know, what you can do if you're getting involved in a removing invasives project. At our house, we take down buckthorn trees, and we put in seeds and plants and try to get, you know, other things to grow. So that's been our contribution. Public projects, if you can get involved in teaching other people. I know a lot of the master naturalists really like to get involved in those projects where they're teaching other people about things, you know, school groups, you know, adult groups who want to learn what they can do, hands-on helping with the project. One that I was involved in here in Syracuse is my daughter was in high school until a couple years ago, and A couple of us got together and started planting native plants on the school grounds. And we ended up taking over 5 beds of plants, pulling out the, you know, ornamental type shrubs that were in there and putting in natives, which are now pretty much self-sustaining. We still go in and do a little bit of weeding here and there, but they're doing really, really well. So public projects is a great way to do it. Support of any groups doing good work. I think I've got some of those listed, you know, later on, so I'll show those to you. Lifestyle changes and teaching others. So I've got a little bit more on that, on those in future slides. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about a good way to get started with native plants. If you don't know this one, this is a marsh milkweed. They do like wetter areas. They're blooming right now. They're absolutely gorgeous little plants. Planting milkweed is something that we all should do somewhere. And if you can't do it at your home, go find a spot in nature where you can put some milkweed in the ground. Extremely valuable and important plant, as I mentioned, for the monarchs. Second thing I've listed there is start with plants. What I mean by that is don't start with seeds. Start with the actual buying a plant somewhere from a good native nursery and put that in the ground. Learn some yard basics that will help pollinators and other wildlife. Learn how to remove invasive plants and learning how to stratify seeds. So just a few different ways you can get involved there. It's a picture of the swamp milkweed. I've got mentioned seed balls there. I'll mention that at the end as well, how to do that. Mentioned that. When you go to pick plants, native plants to put in, an important thing to do is to avoid cultivars, and sometimes they're called nativars, meaning native cultivars. That means they're based on native plants, but they are cultivars. So a cultivar is where we take one with a particular trait that we like, and we just grow those strains, and then we give it a name. And when we grow just those, they often are not as good for the insects that rely on them. So this is an example of the native plant Echinacea purpurea, but on the right is a cultivar of that echinacea. The way you would see it written on a tag in a store is it would say Echinacea purpurea, and then it would have a name in quotes. This one is Powwow Wild Berry. If you see unusual colors, it's usually a hint that it's not just the native plant. And the problem with these cultivars or nativars is they are often not as good for wildlife. They often have much reduced amounts of nectar, so that hummingbirds and insects that try to get food from them might not get enough food. They might be kind of tricked into it, and that can cause them to, you know, cause stress on them or can possibly kill them. Other plants, for example, don't have seeds or have very few seeds, which maybe sounds great to us in terms of cleanup, but it means that the birds that eat the seeds don't have seeds to eat. So in my garden, I do have some echinacea, and the finches feed on those seeds all winter long. So if they didn't have the seeds or had fewer seeds, that would not be good for the birds. All right, if you are going to plant some natives, you want to start by assessing your yard. Do you have sun? Do you have shade? What kind of plants will grow there? How wet is it? And also think about what is there now. This is actually my house in Minnesota. We had lots of hostas. We had lots of grass. We ended up taking out a huge swath of grass, probably an area 20 feet by 75 feet. Killed the grass and put in native plants. Initially, we wood chipped these, falling, filled in around it. and it was just beautiful. The plants were spreading, and we had a good diversity of plants to bring in lots of different kinds of insects and animals. But basically, look at what you have, look at what's there. You know, in this example, would you pull those hostas up? Would you kill all the grass? Would you start in a small area? Generally, starting small is a good idea. But think about what you can do. Okay, a few yard basics. How to unlearn gardening. So many of the ways that we normally garden are ways that really aren't so great for the plants and the insects and the animals. So first of all, don't always deadhead flowers, because that's going to mean that the seeds don't develop, and a lot of our birds need the seeds. Second, leave the leaves and the stalks in place. So for example, when it comes fall, instead of raking all those leaves up, just leave them there on your beds. Or if you rake them off your grass, sometimes you can rake them onto the flower beds. And also stalks from a lot of plants. And you'll find that a lot of butterflies and moths and other insects will overwinter in those leaves. And you'll want to leave them there really until about things start warming up. Normally I'd say mid-May, but this year probably a little bit later, because then those moths and butterflies and other insects will start coming out of those leaves, and then it will be safe to break them up if you need to. So the next thing I've listed there is leave snags if safe. So a snag is a dead tree. If you have a dead tree that you can leave in your yard, some woodpecker is going to be very grateful. So woodpecker hole in this picture here. Dead trees are such an integral part of forest life. And in our yards, if we have trees and we just cut them down when they die, then they're not there for all the insects and birds that need to utilize those. So if it is a safe situation where you can just leave that dead tree up there, that is a great thing to support wildlife. Bare soil and small rocks are really great things to have in whatever area you have for native plants, because those are things that some insects and butterflies and other creatures need. So for example, some kinds of bees, they're called miner bees. They are solitary bees, and they will dig into bare soil to build their homes. These are not ground hornets, which can be scary, but they just dig their hole in the soil, and that's where they live and lay their eggs. And then small rocks, sometimes if there's a moist area with rocks, butterflies will sip water from that. Having a water source, if possible, is also a great way to support wildlife. And then the last thing I wrote there is remove and replace. So what I mean by that is take out something, take out an ornamental, take out some hostas, take out some grass, and then put in the natives. And you know, just slowly work your way through whatever area you have and you can do. Native gardens often look a little bit different than regular gardens. You might think in a typical garden, you might expect a shrub and then a whole bunch of wood chips and then another shrub or a solitary flower. But in nature, this is more what things look like. They all grow up together and they support and interact with each other. So think about that if you are planting some natives. Think about how your plants can grow up and grow together and fill in the space, because that is how they will grow the best and support nature the best. All right. Insects need to eat plants to survive. So when you're planting things, so often when we put things in our yard, we're like, oh yeah, this doesn't get it damaged by insects, right? That's really the way we think about our gardens. We think about them as trying to protect them from insects. But in nature, insects need to eat plants. That's what they do. So this is a monarch caterpillar eating a milkweed leaf. If you see a milkweed leaf and it's getting munched, that means you're being successful. And that's something it's so strong in our mindset that we don't want our leaves eaten on our plants. So in terms of native planting, getting native plants in the ground, expect them to be eaten. I mean, of course, there are things that can be really damaging can come along. There are invasive insect species, for example. That's a whole nother talk. But just think about it in terms of those plants in your garden. In general, it's good if you see a leaf and it's gotten munched. That means you're being successful. All right, a little bit about how to remove non-native plants. This is the work we did at the school. We literally went in with our shovels and we dug up that plot. We got those plants and the bulbs out of there. Other ways to do it, you can cover with black plastic or paper, put some mulch on top of that and wait for things to die, especially if you cycle through that a couple times. Put stuff down, let stuff grow back, put it down, the plastic back down. That can really help to reduce the seed bank in the ground. Using herbicides is something that I never thought I would do, but the more I learned, there are some circumstances where that may be the best way to use a very small amount of herbicides to get rid of the invasive plants. I, for example, use herbicide when I cut down buckthorn trees, and there's a way you can use just the tiniest amount that just goes into the root of the plant. So it's a little controversial. I'd use it in very certain circumstances. All right, I'm going to try to go through these last ones pretty quickly because we're coming up on 45 minutes, but we're pretty close here. If you ever want to start plants from seeds, I'll just mention the term stratification. It's where you put them in a moist situation in cold, like in your refrigerator, over the winter, and that will help the seeds be ready to grow in the spring. Again, I recommend you start with plants initially as you get into native plants. Working on public projects, I mentioned that. Supporting groups who are working on the bigger picture. So here are just a list of groups that are working on some of these issues. Monarch Watch, specifically working on with monarch butterflies. Wild Ones is a great group, and they have so much information on what plants are native in what areas. Our group in Central New York has a list of what plants you can get from what nurseries. So a lot of information out there to help you. Center for Biological Diversity, they work a little bit more on the animal end of things, but they do some work with plants. A couple others there, Organic Consumers Association, Audubon, Cornell Lab of Ornithology. These are all groups that you can support to help with these same ideas. Xerces Society is another one. Lifestyle changes. If you want to do other things yourself that can help support the environment, eating organically, locally produced food, moving towards a plant-based diet, things the way they are in the country right now, that might happen to more people than expected it. And very importantly, teach others, you know, in any situation that you can, get other people involved in planting natives. And then finally, if any of you are interested in making your own, these are often called seed bombs, which is not a term I particularly like. I just call them seed balls. You can get dry clay, mix it with a little bit of compost, add a little bit of water, and then you can gently incorporate seeds into those balls. And then you want to plant those as soon as possible. A lot of people dry them out. I think it's a good idea as soon as you get that made, throw it somewhere any place that you think some plants might take hold, you can plant those. You can also do it at your house, but I think in general at your house you would just put them in the ground, but there are a lot of good places to put them out in nature. All right, so that is what I have. So I'm going to stop my share and put my video back on. And then I can answer any questions. So Christy, you can help guide people to ask questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Sterling. That was very, very nice and very thorough, and a lot of good information. So if anybody wants to ask a question, you can either do it in the chat box or you can unmute yourself and ask. I'll start it out. Leah asked in the chat box, is there a best practice you recommend for removing lesser celandine? This is a question I've been asked a lot lately.
I know we were working on that at Baltimore Woods, and I have not been directly involved with it. So I don't know, but I could probably find out what they are doing there. So Christy, could you maybe keep track of whoever is asking that, and I can try to get that information to you, or I could send it to you, Christy.
Sure.
And then
yep.
you could.
I sure can. Let's see, there's another question. Can you talk about what native, oops, can you talk about what native grasses can be planted to replace regular, whoops, somebody else typed something in it, regular lawn grasses in areas where you need to walk or have access?
I don't know specific varieties. I know that there are some that don't need mowing, but they're still not native. And I know there are some native plants where it's not grasses. It really depends on how much walking there's going to be. If it's very little walking, then some plants will work. If it's still a high traffic area, it would be other varieties, and I don't know specifics. What we did in our last house is we put in a walkway with like flagstone patio, and then we planted things around that so that we had a place to walk that wasn't grass, and then all the other natives were around it. So that doesn't address it specifically, but you would have to look up those specific types depending on the area and amount of traffic you had.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Let's see, there's another question. Can you tell us a little about seed banks? Are there native plant seed banks in New York that circulate native seeds? And then in parentheses, though I know you said we should begin with native plants and not seeds.
Right, and I mean, you can start with seeds if you want. I only say that because it's so much easier to start with plants. Seeds from native plants take a long time to grow. And even if you buy a plant, you might not see a change for a while. So for example, I bought cardinal flowers when I was new to this. And cardinal flowers are like that tall the first year and that tall the second year. So I was like, this plant is supposed to be 2 feet tall. What is going on? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until the third year that finally, I got this gorgeous, gorgeous, well worth the wait flower. So going from seeds is wonderful too, but if you want to see something soon, buy a few plants. Mm-hmm. So are there seed banks? I don't know of seed banks, but I know a lot of great places to get plants and seeds. Probably the best way to do it, since we're all in different parts of New York, is to go to the Wild Ones site and see what they have, because they're going to be able to give you the resources for your area. Wild Ones was started in the Midwest, I think maybe in Minnesota, but there's a local group here, and I know there are other local groups around, and that's probably the best way to get that more specific information for different areas.
Okay, thank you. Guy asks, I missed the comment about deadheading. When is it best to deadhead? When is it not?
The reason to not deadhead in general is if you deadhead, then that plant is not going to produce their seed. And the seeds are often what the birds eat, and sometimes insects eat as well. So if you leave the flower on there, it's going to go to seed, and then the seed will get eaten. I know there are a few exceptions to that. For example, I've heard that if you cut milkweed back at a certain time of the year, and I don't think that's deadheading, I think that's actually cutting it back, then it'll sort of like have a whole new bloom, which will support other insects later in the year. I have not experimented with that, but in general, leave the flowers on the plant, let them go to seed, and then the seeds they're a part of nature, right? And they will help to sustain wildlife better that way.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer asks, she says she lives in a wooded, shady area. Do you know of any native plants that do well in the shade that would be particularly beneficial?
Yeah, my gardens in Minnesota were shady, and interestingly, the plants in Minnesota, many of them are also native to New York. So one I just mentioned is cardinal flower. It loves the sun. It also does well in part shade, probably not in deep shade, but if you have sort of a moderately shady area, cardinal flowers are beautiful, and they do draw the hummingbirds. They're just stunning, and when you see the hummingbirds coming into them, it's very exciting. So that's one I would recommend. Marsh marigolds, again, they like the sun. I've got them growing in the sun here, but I had them growing in Minnesota in my shady garden there. Beautiful springtime flowers. Woodland poppy is another beautiful yellow plant. It's maybe 1.5 to 2 feet tall, kind of a bushy thing, beautiful yellow flower. So that's a fun one. I love geraniums, the wild geraniums, little pink flowers. So that's another good one. Columbine is a good shade plant. So I think in my garden in Minnesota, I think I counted at one point close to 100 different types of plants. So those are a few, but there are a lot of options out there.
That's a lot. Okay, thank you. Let's see, the next question is from Wally Ramsey. Does anyone know what the policy of state transportation and thruway authority is with regard to native plants and meadows along the roadsides, especially the interstates and thruway? Some states manage the roadsides for native meadows. It seems to me that New York State still likes grass and mowing.
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that question, but I can make a pretty good guess because when you drive around, you mostly see, I see a lot of invasives, at least in upstate. I learned a couple years ago what wild parsnip looks like, and I happened to be traveling up to the Adirondacks right as the wild parsnip was in bloom, and it was everywhere. Every roadside all the way. And I mean, think about it. We mow, right? We mow that lawn, and then in the winter we go along and plow. So we take all the seeds from all those non-native invasive species and shove them all along the side of the highway. And that's what we get. So miles and miles and miles of wild parsnip. So I don't think we do anything good in that way. Whatever states are doing it better, I would love to know where they are because it would be good to learn from them.
Okay. Marla asks, can you recommend any specific brands of herbicide for removing non-native plants?
Okay, so it gets a really bad rap. It's a horrible chemical, but I use glyphosate. Cut the trunk of a tree So I'm thinking buckthorn here. And I got this in a place from Minnesota actually after I was here, but it's like a tube and it's got a little spongy tip. You put in your mix of glyphosate in there, and I think it's 28% is the percentage of it. And you can get a blue marker dye so you can see exactly where you put it. You cut the tree, all you need to do is around the outside, which is the living tissue of the tree. You put such a tiny amount on there, that will be enough to go down to the roots and make sure that the buckthorn doesn't grow back. Buckthorns, I tried not using herbicides for 7 or 8 years before I gave up and started using herbicides on buckthorns. I tried everything, including, covering them with plastic and putting coffee cans over them to keep the light out. They always find a way around it. And they always regrow into this big shrub to the point where I'm like, you have to get rid of it so I can grow other things there. So I use glyphosate, readily available. Don't get it on you. It's a nasty chemical. Use gloves, use goggles. I believe the place in Minnesota is called Landscape Restoration, and they're the ones that sell the little bottles and the blue marking and glyphosate to use. Glyphosate can be used on other things as well as a spray. It's effective. I think it breaks down relatively quickly. Again, I'm not a fan. If you've got another way to do it, do it. But if you don't have another option, it works.
Okay, great. That's all the questions that I see in the chat box. Does anybody else have anything you want to ask? You can unmute yourself and ask, or well, if not, I'm going to yeah, just open it up in case if anybody wants to share like what they're doing. If you've been doing any volunteer